Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the first in a discussion series on global religious and secular dynamics. My name is José Casanova, and I'm a sociologist, a professor of sociology and professor of theology and religious studies at Georgetown University, as well as a senior fellow at the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, which sponsors this series. Good afternoon here in the East Coast, where both Charles Taylor and I am, but I know some of you is good morning in the West Coast. For others, it's good evening in Europe, in the Middle East, good night in Asia, and even past midnight in Australia. Welcome all. We are fortunate to have as the first speaker in our series, in our conversations, the great living philosopher, Canadian, Quebecois, Charles Taylor. Charles, welcome to our conversation. We are going to have a conversation between both of us. We are going to cover 4 topics: a secular age, the crisis of democracy, linguistic anthropology, our global human condition, and a Catholic modernity. It will be fast conversation, perhaps a bit superficial, but I think that it blends well key aspects of Charles Taylor's life work. After our conversation, we'll have a 20-minute period for question and answer. And so please, you have there the chat, and you can write your questions and answers, and we'll try to give you the opportunity for Charles Taylor to respond. Without further ado, Charles, good afternoon. Again, it's a great pleasure to have you with us. It would be much better if we could be physically together, but this is still a substitute. It's important that we keep socially connected and intellectual conversation under those conditions of physical distance. So again, let's begin with A Secular Age. This is a book that obviously made you famous beyond philosophy. It became almost, you could say, an intellectual bestseller. Did you expect such a response to the book A Secular Age when you were writing it?
No, I didn't. Thought it would be largely ignored by most people, but just specialists in the field might find some interesting ideas. You remember we worked it out together. I finished the draft in discussions with you and Hans Joas very intensely in Berlin, and I thought of them as a continuation of that kind of discussion among sociologists and philosophers. And suddenly, to my surprise, it
certainly went beyond anybody's expectation, and I'm so pleased that it happened. So now, one of the concepts you develop in the book, you had already begun developing, is this of the immanent frame. Explain what do you mean by the immanent frame, and how is it connected with our secular age?
Yes, well, I'm trying to get at there what we all understand, that we all understand. People's understanding of what they share in their understanding of their situation. Now, if you go back to the Middle Ages, early modern period in Europe, there was a biblical story that everyone accepted. There was a fight between different versions of Christianity. There was a sense that we also lived in a cosmos with moral orders, that the various kingdoms and so on were based on these cosmic realities, etc. And today, it's really very, very different. What we all understand, that we all understand across all civilizations, is roughly speaking the natural science view of the natural world, the sense that our different societies have all been created by human beings at a certain time, revolutions and so on, the sense that we live in an immense time frame stretching back unimaginably millions of years in the evolution of the universe. Then we have different positions within that. Some of us are into certain faiths, others are against faiths, and so on. But everybody understands that that's what everybody understands, starting point. And that's what I call the if you like, the frame, and I call it immanent frame because its elements are totally immanent and not transcendent.
So this is the immanent frame, meaning it's based on horizontal institutions without any reference to transcendence. They all operate as if God would not exist, right? Et si Deus non daretur. And obviously in Europe, the emergence of this immanent frame, perhaps because it was there that it had to be developed, had very negative consequences for the survival of traditional forms of Christianity. The expectation was that as the immanent frame becomes globalized to other civilizations, the same will happen. The same process of decline of religion, and basically rather purely secular is the only option for normal life, would also happen. But this has not been the case. So how can we explain that within such an immanent frame, such a diversity of possibilities of global religious and secular dynamics are possible?
Yeah. Well, I think you guys have to turn it around. Why should that change people's mind? It means, of course, that one's religious faith is in a quite different context. I mean, think of religious faith, 16th century, a world of magic forces, God as a being that could defend us against that. But it's perfectly possible to turn it around and say, within this immanent frame, people are searching for meaning. They're searching for a sense of what human beings can become, how they can grow, and so on. And some people are going to see that growth, that development, that journey towards something greater in terms of religious faiths. And indeed, what we find in the immanent frame now is a tremendous growth and diversification of different ideas of what spiritual development is. So it's, in a sense, it's a different context. It inflects all faith positions differently, but it doesn't rule out the possibility of faith, quite the contrary.
Right. And yet you, in your lifetime, you've experienced personally the great transformation of Quebecois society. From being a uniformly Catholic, and then suddenly almost a homogeneous, radically secular. So it seems that Quebec is almost a confirmation of the European notion of a self-fulfilling prophecy of secular modernity. And yet we see that parallel to that in Latin America, you see the transformation of the societies, their own silent revolutions, leading into all kinds of religious pluralism. So how do we explain under which conditions then one seems to, this immanent frame seems to lead to homogeneous secularity, and when does it open up the possibility for precisely all forms of pluralism?
Yeah. Well, you see, if the previous period in which there was this almost unanimous belief in this case, the Catholic Church in Quebec, if it was a period in which people really suffered certain kinds of restriction, oppression, being forced to do things they didn't want to do and so on, then the change in the global understanding of where we are at is seen as a possibility where we can get rid of all this, we can throw it all away. And that's what, of course, was lived in my society in Quebec. But if you take a society on the other end of the spectrum, like the United States, which in a sense became plural, roughly around the time of the Great Awakening, or the Great Awakenings, maybe the second one in the early 19th century, then it's a quite different situation. And so you see these very, very different ways of responding. And again, in the Latin American case, in Brazil and so on, is something different again. What's clear in all these cases is you get pluralism, plurification, growth of different possibilities. And that exists here too, because in the generation after the one that threw the church out in Quebec, there are young people that are saying, well, what are we going to do with our lives? We're searching for some kind of meaning, for some kind of, in some cases, spiritual growth. And that's happening in all sorts of ways. So it depends. If the experience previous to pluralism was very negative, then it leads to this rejection of religion.
Right. So it seems there is also, as you point out, a radical transformation. Pluralism was viewed as a negative fact. This is what explains the wars of religion. Nobody could imagine the possibility of different religious beliefs in the same society. There had to be homogeneity. That's the Westphalian model. while we've moved from this model in which plurality of beliefs, which are heresies or false doctrines, to a positive recognition of plurality as a positive development into pluralism. To which extent this is one of the factors of our global condition, recognition of a kind of irremediable plurality, especially in the field of the world system of religions.
Yes, well, I think that this causes its reactions, and we have various parts of the world in which it's still thought to be a disaster. So now it's thought as something that has to be stamped out and really, very, very tight discipline. If you look at the evolution of a society like Pakistan, it's really very, very worrying, but it's very much illustrative of that. Pakistan was started with the idea of an Islamic state that was Islamic state culturally, that was connected to the culture of the Mughals and so on. And it's slowly evolved towards a state that is, for many people, Islamic in the narrowest possible sense of Wahhabi type discipline around a very narrow notion of the Sharia. So you get people who are on death row now for being accused of blasphemy and so on. So there are reactions to this kind of pluralism in various parts of the world, and they become, in a certain sense, even more viciously narrow than the original rather conformist societies.
But of course, the paradox here is that we know that Jinnah, the founder of the idea of Pakistan, himself was really an atheist. He didn't take Islamic belief seriously. Muslim identity, yes, but not Islamic belief.
Even worse than that, he was a member of a sect that would be probably victims of drive-by killings, a sort of ultra-Shiite sect, and yet he's still revered. There's a kind of tremendous cognitive dissonance in Pakistan. So he was both not really a believer, but he was connected to a sect which is considered not really Islamic anymore by anyway, lots of Pakistanis.
This leads us to the next topic of the crisis of democracy. And to a large extent, it has to do also with attempts to impose the kind of religious or ethno-religious homogeneity that, of course, was also the model of Westphalia. This is what happened in Europe. And to a large extent, there has been a tragic repetition of this model of ethno-religious uniformity for the sake of the nation state, kind of religious nationalism. This is one of the crises of democracy, but there are many others which have to do with even populist rejections of liberal democracy in the West. You've been working with your friends, with Craig Calhoun, with Dilip, on a new book precisely analyzing this crisis of democracy and how we can somehow respond to it. You've been involved in democracy both as a political thinker, but also as an activist. You're one of the founding members of the New Democratic Party of Canada. You have been a social democrat before Bernie Sanders was a social democrat. And to a certain extent, you've been always very much involved, both intellectually, but also politically involved in democracy. So how do you see our contemporary moment, and what is the fundamental, for you, the most fundamental crisis of democracy today?
Well, I think the fight of Western democracy, the crisis is of the rise of what we call, not really very aptly, populism. And that is, there's a sense among the idea that one has to mobilize the people defined as ordinary people who are not part of the elites, but the mobilization is around extremely, as you say, extremely narrow notions of identity that exclude others, that exclude people with varieties of ways of approaching. And I think that this has different sources. One of the sources in our Western societies has been that a lot of ordinary people were neglected in the era, you might say, of neoliberalism, where there was a globalization carried through without any concern for whether there were victims, losers, as well as gainers from this, without any attempt to inflect the gains so that make sure that everybody was on board. And I think the United States is a key example of that kind of cause, where where the society moved more and more towards galloping inequality and tremendous deprivation. And that's one of the things that could easily turn into populism. Then if you go to the other end of the Western world and you look at a country like Poland, it's somewhat different. It's that they had this experience of their nationalism, which is very much linked with the Catholic Church, a rather narrow idea of the Catholic Church, suppressed for years, for decades under communist regime. And so when the liberation comes back, it's easier to argue by people who have this kind of view that that's really what Poland is all about, and that it's not about being open, liberal, plural, and so on. So there are different kinds of origin of this thing, but it happens that we're in a, I don't know why, in a constellation in the world in which these bad movements are winning. I mean, even India, which is not connected to the Western world at all, Indian democracy is moving in a very worrying direction with Modi, with a kind of very narrow notion of Hindutva, with persecuting the largest minority. The second largest Muslim society in the world in terms of population has just had a law passed which, as it were, doesn't recognize Muslims as Indian citizens. So we have this.
You mentioned Poland. What is to me evident in this contemporary regime in Poland is a very clear critique of rule of law, of justice, formal justice by experts, but also of liberalism in the name of majoritarian democracy. So you have an affirmation of the rule of the majority, but without concern for minority rights, and without concern really for a fundamental constitutional order that protects everybody. To me, it's a dissociation of three elements of democracy that were also separated in the 19th century. Liberals used to be anti-democrats, Democrats used to be anti-liberals, and you could have a rule of law in Prussia that was neither liberal nor democrat. So part of the problem, and we see it in Trump, it's purely majoritarian rule without any also concern for institutions, legal institutions, rule of law, and also a certain totally disconcern for the rights of minorities. So to which extent is a fundamental problem today, how to bring together? Because one understands the critique of liberal elites, and the critiques of basically pure expertise, legal formalism. But when it goes to undermining the fundamental legal constitutional structures and protection of minority rights, then there is a fundamental problem. So to which extent this is a fundamental issue today?
I think it's absolutely fundamental, but how to defeat it is the big question. What powers it is a sense of the national identity, which is very much this in a narrow sense anchored mostly in the past, and a tremendous fear around that. So the fear around losing that is what makes all these illiberal regimes try to make their power irreversible. So what you see in all of them, in Hungary, they've succeeded in doing that. In Poland, the fight now is that the reigning party is trying to, as it were, change the judicial system, fire judges and so on. The idea is to make it irreversible. What you see in the Trump regime with the Republicans in the United States, well, Republicans in general have been trying to have this kind of irreversibility by vote suppressing and so on. And in the case of Trump, if you go to any length to make sure that he doesn't get turned out, there's completely abandoned the idea of a democratic society in which, well, we rule for a while and then you take over and you rule for a while, but you open the possibility of it continuing. So how you undermine that immense fear around a certain identity, which makes it just inconceivable or horrible to think that one could ever change, that is the big challenge today.
And of course, as you point out, the growing global problem of growing economic inequality and social inequality. To this, we add the global pandemic, and it has also precisely made clear, manifest, the consequence of these inequalities. But then it has produced a retrenching towards precisely national autarkic, almost mercantilism, right? Even the European Union closing its inner borders once again, abandoning the Schengen model, and retracting to a purely national unit. Lives Matter protest, that under those conditions, despite the fear of contagion, you have people risking their health for the sake of an idea. It's not anymore simply Blacks, African Americans, but now you see a very wide spread of the population supporting the both participating, but also a majority of the American population supporting the demonstration. So do you see here a point of influx towards a revitalization of democracy?
Yes, I think I do. And there was one good thing that came from the COVID crisis, one good thing, which was in many, many societies, an immense wave of solidarity, which precisely bridged the divisions, in many cases, that had existed before. And I think that sense of solidarity, greater solidarity, we're faced with the same crisis, with the same danger, with the same enemy, as it were. People said at the beginning, it's like a wartime. And I think that's very true. It's like the declaration of wartime, which I'm still old enough to remember in the Second World War, when a lot of lines of division were closed because people thought we have a common enemy, we have to get together and fight them. And I think that stronger sense of solidarity is partly explaining the wonderful reaction to the killing of George Floyd. I mean, it's partly the horrible scene in which he was killed, but I think it's also because there's a sense that we have to hang together now. We have to create a kind of unity, and that's why, not just in the United States, but worldwide, in Canada and elsewhere, there is this very strong feeling, no, we can't carry on like this with these kinds of hierarchical views of who really matters. And we have to do something about it. I think that comes from the very context of the COVID crisis in which it arose.
Right, especially the realization to the extent to which discriminated racial minorities have been disproportionately impacted by this inequality, by the crisis. So in this respect, this is a very positive aspect. For me, the fundamental question remains, however, that the answers have been purely national so far. And we know that these crises are global crises that require also transnational solidarity also in their response. And so part of the problem I see today is the weakening of the transnational, international structure, partly because of the United States, that was the leader, has abandoned it, and partly because of the growth of authoritarian regimes in China, in Russia, in India, etc., that are not interested in creating these transnational structures. So the point is, to which extent we need to go beyond internal democracy precisely towards developing structures of transnational solidarity, because it's not only the global pandemic, it's of course the global ecological crisis, it's the crisis of global refugees, it's the crisis of basically global inequality. None of these problems can be solved in one single country. If you wish social democracy in one country, is not possible today, for economic reasons, for many reasons. So how can we go both reinforce national democracies to make them lively and responsive to people, but at the same time be able to transcend them? So how can we do that?
Well, I think we have some of the basis for doing that in the way we've responded to the coronavirus crisis, because the idea is we must, first of all, the solidarity within the society, but secondly, the idea that here is something really overriding our normal concerns for my own prosperity or my own job and so on. It's something that goes beyond that and that can only be fought on an international level. So you could imagine we could emerge from this with a sense that, we have to pull together not only within societies, but between societies, and we could start a new kind of movement, which would mean that we would have a more effective fight against global climate change as well. What tells against that is that we've spent a tremendous amount of money, rightly, keeping people afloat who've lost their jobs or businesses that couldn't function and so on. And I know there'll be people who will be saying at the end of all this, if there ever is an end to all this, look, we're so much in debt, we can't possibly afford a program of really fighting for against global climate change and so on. And I think left and right are going to line up as we leave this crisis around that issue. Does this, I mean, one thing is to say, what it showed us, we were terribly unprepared to face this kind of thing because we ran down our health systems, our old folks' homes and so on. Let's never do that again. And the other response would be, well, we spend so much money, we're so much in debt, we can't afford it, so let's run them even further down in order to get back to our level of production before the crisis. And I think I don't know exactly who's going to win between this battle. I know which side I'm on, but we have a real chance. We have a real chance because of what's the mindset created in the crisis of doing the right thing for once.
But there was a time, obviously, where you could talk of an international social democracy. In Europe, it gave a new life to the European Union beyond what had originally been a Christian democratic project. But now really social democracy transnationally is in serious crisis. Throughout Europe, we see it. And so how can we somehow recover this tradition, and how can we revitalize it for our contemporary global condition? I'm not sure, but obviously you've been at this fight for a long time. So do you have any idea of how this
we need a new
solidarity?
We need new kinds of alliances. Even in a way, there were moments in our history, like the New Deal, the first New Deal in the United States was a recreation of a new kind of alliance to fight a crisis that hadn't existed before. And people are talking now in the United States of a Green New Deal. It's the same idea. But in the countries of Europe, we have to have a new alignment. I mean, for instance, in Germany, it has to be an alignment of various left parties and the Greens. The Greens are a very important possible vehicle of this. When you think of the election in Bavaria last year, that a lot of the votes lost by the right wing went to the Greens. So it won't be simply a social democratic, or in France, a socialist party has virtually disappeared, but it could be a realignment which produces in a new situation a new political force. And I think the possibility is there, where a lot of young people are at in all our societies at this point politically, they're ready to move in that direction. But we have to be creative in bringing about the new kinds of alignments.
And if we can move now to, in your life work, you've basically been a consistent critic of what could be called any form of naturalism. Naturalism, your first critique in your book, The Explanation of Behavior in 1963-64, against precisely the model of the natural sciences to understand human societies, to understand social science, human sciences. You develop a communitarian critique of liberalism, which has also some of these elements. A critique of purely formalist epistemologies. And now in your new book, The Language Animal, a book which I do recommend everybody to read. This is the book that, at the base of which you receive one of the last big prizes, right? You had the Templeton Prize, then the Kyoto Prize, the Kluge Prize together with Jürgen Habermas from the Library of Congress, and then the Berkley Prize. Now, this is a book in which you try to, it's called The Language Animal. Very clearly, could be called the language mammal. We are an animal species. And the attempt to any type of epistemology, any type of understanding of reason which is disembodied and disembedded from social context will not work. The subtitle is The Full Shape of the Human Linguistic Capacity. And you develop a critique of, you put two different types of linguistic anthropology. One, right, HLC, Habs, Lack, Condillac, and then the three H's of German Romanticism, Hammond, Humboldt, Herder. What do you mean by this critique of a purely designative theory of language that only is an utensil? It's again useful, but really is not constitutive of us as humans. Can you explain?
You see, the Hobbes, Locke, Condillac, all those three thinkers, what they were interested in language for was, well, language enables us to formulate information, record it, communicate it to others. They were thinking always of how does it help us build a science of the world, right? And their followers in the modern and analytic philosophy theories of language, with a certain number of very important changes really introduced by Frege, are really focusing on the same thing. But if you look at human beings and language, it's just obvious that it's doing other things for us. If you look at art, if you look at literature, if you look at the role of metaphor, incidentally, metaphor is the enemy for Hobbes and Locke and Condillac. They're constantly saying, they're confusing science if you use this word for that, right? See, but metaphor, we live by metaphors, but also what language does is it relates us to each other. So I'm thinking of linguistic anthropologists like Michael Silverstein in Chicago, who have really shown that language creates, as it were, communication between people, and it therefore sets up all kinds of relations with people, including hierarchical relations between people. And so, when I was a kid in Quebec, everybody, we used to speak to our parents with the familiar, in French, tu, and they would speak to us with vous, and between classes, it was also like that, right? And we've had a revolution in the modern world in which people have struggled against that. And in places like Sweden, I understand everyone calls everyone else tu or du now, right? So what is language doing there? Language is framing how people relate to each other, right? And it does all sorts of things of this kind, all sorts of functions in human life, other than simply collecting information, building sciences, which is not to say that that's not important. It's tremendously important, but you have to see this capacity, scientific capacity, as it were, placed within a much broader range. That's why I use that subtitle, the full range of the human linguistic capacity. I wanted to bury that kind of theory once and for all.
So let's talk then about the global pandemic and how this reinforces these issues. On the one hand, our embeddedness in the life world of nature and the virus, we are part of the same life world and so on, right? Then the other, the lack of communication or the physical separation, but then the connectivity through media. But one of the strengths of the new media is, of course, the focus on artificial intelligence and big data, the kind of thing that precisely reinforces the other notion of reduced linguistic capability. So to which extent what we are doing now, despite doing it through media, still is able to reinforce this notion of a linguistic capacity that goes beyond precisely gathering of information, big data, purely a kind of mechanistic artificial intelligence, that machines are more rational than we are and therefore they are better than we are. So what are the lessons of the pandemic in this respect?
Well, I think that, there's a perpetual temptation, it's the great technological temptation to be able to reduce everything to machine intelligence and so on. And I think we're going to find with the pandemic, it's going to work in both directions for exactly the usual reasons. That there's a certain kind of mindset which is going to say, well, let's have a systems of control working out what people should be allowed to do or not do by machine intelligence. And then there are going to be other people who are saying, well, these are never going to work because human beings have to be brought to, motivated towards, have to, in virtue of the certain notions of what they owe to other people in their society, like the sense of solidarity we have today, that's an important part of it. And you can't talk about a machine intelligence which is feels solidarity. I mean, you can't talk about a machine that feels anything, and that's why there's a perpetual fallback, falling short of these claims that are made for artificial intelligence. Now, there are certain things that it really can very well do. It can, like, can calculate much more quickly than ordinary human beings. But there are certain functions that it just can't take over. So what we get is, in my long life, I've seen there are booms and busts. There was a theory of psychology which was behaviorist when I was younger, and I wrote a book saying it was no good. And it collapsed, and I thought for a moment I did it, but I didn't do it. I did it collapse of its own weight. But then people who have a mechanistic mindset needed something, so they found the computer. Oh, the computer, that's it. Nothing, not simply looking at behavior, but looking at the computers. And there was a whole wave of that, and then that collapsed. And then you see but there is this motivation always to find for a certain mindset. It's the kind of Cartesian being masters and possessors of nature mindset that pushes people. And we're going to have this series of booms and busts, booms and busts, booms and busts, but there's always going to be a version of a mechanistic outlook, which is riding high.
Let's move then on to the question of different narratives. Precisely, it's not only that we need feelings and machines, but also narratives are parts of what constitute us as selves and group identities. And as you point out in your big narrative of a secular age, the question is not to get rid of narratives, but simply you have to come up with better, more compelling, more basically hermeneutically full narratives. One of them is you develop a text, is not well known, a Catholic modernity. What did you mean with this narrative of a Catholic modernity? What were you after?
I was after trying to find ways of being Catholic that made sense in the world we're now in, right? And I felt that the ways of being Catholic that we were offered by the established churches, remember that I was brought up in Quebec before the Quiet Revolution, before this breakout, were just designed to repel people, particularly young people, and send them out elsewhere. So I was trying to struggle through to the idea of modes of being Catholic that would make sense today. And of course, that led me to the surrounding idea that what it means to be a Catholic has been very different in different ages, and this has evolved and has changed and so on. And in that, I was partly inspired by the theology that underlay Vatican II. The theology of people like Dulubac and Yves Congar, and their idea was, let's go back to the fathers of the church and see what was going on then, and then we'll have a point of view from outside our present situation in which to ask if it are ways of operating now. And it's against the anti-modernism, which was really itself very recent because it was based on really the Tridentine mindset. They had a way of understanding that we're going to have different ways of being Catholic, but let's find the one that makes sense for us. That's really what got me going, and eventually led to my making this lecture. And then from there on, the discussion
If we
started.
can continue in this vein, obviously you've always insisted that medieval Catholicism was much more open and pluralist than even later Catholicism, right? Although we see it as the golden age of Catholicism, it was much more precisely pluralist than the one that comes out of the Tridentine and then, of course, of Vatican I. You refer to Vatican II. For me, always what is obvious from reading Vatican II is the associated fathers who are from all over the world suddenly are aware of this global condition, the sign of the times, that globalization, they don't use the name yet, but whether it is Nostra Aetate, whether it is Dignitatis Humanae, whether it is Gaudium et Spes, this idea of the signs of the times of a new global age is very, very powerful. Now, in this lecture, you refer to Matteo Ricci as a possibility of an alternative form of Catholicism. And indeed, for me, as you know, I've been working on the Jesuits and globalization, precisely looking for an alternative form of competing models of Catholic globalization, that of inspired by the Catholic kings, right? The Portuguese, the Spanish, the French, or by Rome that will come with propaganda fide. Here you have this model of based on open communication, accommodation to other cultures, partly the same way that, as you say, the Danielou and Congar may have gone to the patristic. They went to St. Paul and the Gentiles, and they realized that if early Christianity could be Latin and Greek, two radically different forms of Christianity, it could also be Chinese, it could also be Indian, Hindu. And therefore the idea is that of multiple Catholicisms. So the Christian story itself is universal, but it is embedded in very particular cultures and understandings and contexts. And so Christian universalism cannot be the globalization of Roman centralism, but it will have to be some form of understanding of the multiplicities of Catholicism through history and today now in the globe. So we know that part of the project of this Pope Francis is precisely the acceptance of these multiple local churches. How do you think that this is something which still can be brought back despite the very strong resistance of Catholic uniformity?
Well, I think it's what's going to make it irreversible is the fact that the majority of Catholics are already the case outside of Europe and North America, outside of the olds that were West. And what we're also looking at is the effect of the decline of the imperial West, right? If you know, modern history of the West is more complex than people think. In the 18th century, in the 17th century, there wasn't necessarily this certainty that Europe is absolutely the be-all and end-all, right? There was on the contrary, you get the end of the 18th century, people like Burke who are horrified at the way the British imperialists are treating the Indian Empire and so on, because they're destroying another culture. You go through the 19th century and you get this total belief that Europe has the answers to everything. You know, right and left, Marx and John Stuart Mill both agreed that it's a good thing that the Indians are under British rule because they'll get shaped up properly so that they can be modern men. And I think the disappearance of that, and it's reflected in the Catholic Church by the fact that the majority, or close to the majority of Catholics, are outside this original imperial core, means that the idea of imposing the European model, I think, is utterly, it has no chance at all. It can't possibly succeed. I know that there are holdouts in the Vatican still, and there are holdouts in certain parts of the European and North American Catholicism, but the movement of history is just not going to make this possible.
Okay, I'm sure that the audience has been very much quiet listening to us. I think it's time to end our conversation between both of us, our dialogue, and to open up to some of the panelists. I already see some questions coming from some close friends, common friends. Let's say I see a question from Paolo Costa, who is the translator of A Secular Age into Italian. And he has the question, has the experience of the COVID-19 pandemic and of how the various religions handled the health emergency affected in some ways your understanding of secularization?
Well, no, I don't think it has really. I think that what I've found interesting and encouraging in the COVID crisis, as I said earlier, is a creation of a new kind of solidarity in societies. But I don't think that it's had any effect at all on the really big evolution that I was talking about, which is the evolution towards a world in which there's an immense number of spiritual people on a spiritual search, on a spiritual journey. The number of these people is growing, but the number of possible journeys is also growing. And I think that the whole COVID crisis could only accentuate this further, right? People are, very often in the face of all this, people are turned to issues of what does my life really mean? What is my life based on? What is my whole moral view based on? And I think that that will just accentuate the the spread of this kind of searching.
Okay, there is another question from Bill Barbieri, again a common friend who recently brought you and Michael Walser together to American Catholic University to discuss the crisis of democracy. And Bill asked, Charles, I'd be interested in any thoughts you might have in this moment about race and racism and how they're implicated in, first, the dynamics of secular modernity, second, our present democratic crisis, and third, our linguistic anthropology and how deep racial categories help structure modern thought.
I think it's very, very interesting, but very, very hidden. I think what you have in a great number of Western countries, including ours, is a kind of unspoken, unstressed sense of hierarchy. Who comes first, who comes second, right? There, it's not the old racism of, we don't want these people all around us, but a new kind of racism that, well, this kind of person counts. The people who came first count more than the people who came later, or the people of this race count more than the people of that race. We have a certain amount of racism in Canada, but we also have this in relation to Aboriginals in Canada. A lot of mainstream Canadians coming from elsewhere originally have that sense. And it doesn't emerge until the people who are thus disadvantaged protest. And then you get a lot of very harsh reactions, but not an awful lot of theorization because you can't say these things. I mean, there are white supremacists who do say these things, but they're a small minority of those who share these responses. So the big question, the big challenge for us is how to overcome these largely unspoken attitudes, which even the people who have them don't quite recognize that they have them. They don't quite recognize they're being racist. They just think it's kind of normal that. So when Black Lives Matter movements start, a lot of whites are tremendously indignant at this, and they rationalize it, like Trump, we're against disorder, we're against looting, and so on. But actually, what it comes from is a sense that why are these people objecting? They're in their proper place and they're getting their due deserts. And that, I think, is the insidious kind of racism is something we have to defeat. Now, there's a whole lot of things we can do about that, but I think that's a fact we have to see in our societies.
Okay, there is a question from Aristotle Papanikolaou from the Public Orthodoxy Center at Fordham University. And they are related to, again, orthodoxy, but the more broader question of the secular race. How do you respond to the critique that the culture of secular is Western and in this sense constructed and used for colonial interests? And then how can you speak to how secularization is taking shape in post-communist countries and in particular Orthodox countries?
Yes. Well, I think that's something that I didn't tackle in the book, and I deliberately didn't tackle it because I think that processes that we can call secularization are very different in very different parts of the world. I mean, it's even not the same thing in, for instance, Latin America as it is. So I was claiming to, as it were, talk about the civilization that emerges from Latin Christendom, and even a big part of that in Latin America, I couldn't really touch on. And because I realized, I think I could justify myself by saying that for a long time in political science department, people talked about secularization as a world movement, which happens in certain countries, like our countries first and other countries afterwards. And this always seemed to me to be absurdly Western-centric, that this whole situation in China, the whole situation in the Muslim world is something very, very different. And there are analogs, but we have to understand them in their own terms. So now that includes, I didn't really talk about the Eastern Orthodox Christian world. And in a certain sense, I've learned more since, because I've had the kind of conversations that I hope the book would as it were, spark, where an Indian friend of mine said, "It's a very interesting book you wrote on Europe, but that didn't happen here." And I said, "Good, that's right, let's have a talk and discuss what did happen there." And I think that that's the talk that I still have to have with friends and colleagues in the world of Greek and Eastern Orthodoxy.
There is a question, several questions on Catholic modernity, and to which extent the aggiornamento is precisely something that is very much linked to this notion of a Catholic modernity. And the other question about aspiring Catholic theologian who has studied the history of Western philosophy and postmodernism, including those trends within the church. I have found it all to be wanting. It is safe to say that the Catholic modernity could be an authentic response to the call for aggiornamento from Pope John XXIII. What I mean is a conversion or a metanoia where we return to the sources in such a way that does not prima facie reject the modern world, nor blindly accepts past views of reality.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I would subscribe to that. That's very, that's very convincing outlook. I mean, I think that what goes along with the aggiornamento is another attitude towards the past, where it doesn't become simply normative, but where you see in the past an immense possible repository of spiritualities that can nourish us today if we connect up to them in our own way. And I think that's going on all the time, that people are, rediscovering the importance of Teresa of Avila, rediscovering the importance of the Desert Fathers and so on, and seeing that as very much related to their particular path as growing in the Christian faith. So it's not a matter of we either follow slavishly the past or we totally reject it. On the contrary, we have to, the whole aggiornamento of the Vatican II was, we have to think of what's appropriate in our time, but in working out what's appropriate in our time, we can find resources right through the whole history of the church and right across the whole geography of the church. And think of how someone like myself have been tremendously helped and fed by certain dimensions of, let's go again to talk about Eastern Orthodox theology, have crept through to me and have been very meaningful to me, even though they're not part of my immediate background as a Catholic.
And then we have a question from David Lehman, prominent sociologist of religion from Cambridge University, working in Latin America and Israel. And his question is, we are finding that the authority of experts, judges, bureaucracy is quite fragile. Is this because religion is not providing the glue, if it ever did, but rather has in many places become a force for polarization precisely at a time when political participation has been spreading and intensifying as advocated by citizenship theory?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that religion is not a single thing, it's split. I think virtually all confessions are split between, very often this is the kind of split between people who really want to return to a past of much greater conformity and greater unanimity around church, mosque, whatever, Ummah, etc., and people who find this new world in which there's a plurality of searchers, in which the searchers are interested in a kind of ecumenicism of exchange with each other, right? So that they're interested in opening their horizons. I think we find these two reactions and they relate rather hostilely to each other. So there isn't a single phenomenon called religion operative here. There is a different kinds of faith, different kinds of ways of entering into faith, which have tremendously different consequences. And I would say that the one that I was writing about, but the one that I also feel I belong to, the world of searchers, is of course much more open and much more favorable to the idea of a really diverse society of mutual respect. Whereas we find that in many cases, the more reactive kind of circling the wagons religiosity is supporting where they turn back to various kinds of populism, even to certain Catholics in the States voting for Donald Trump on that basis.
There's a question from Shauna Rodriguez, who is a PhD candidate at Columbia University. And she writes, deeply diverse democracies like India have negotiated their dilemmas with an Indian form of secularism. But in the process, Islamic justifications for post-colonial democracy or other similar minority justificatory discourses have had to constantly encounter Hindutva majoritarianism. Can rejecting methodological nationalism be one way of dealing with these dilemmas?
Well, I think, again, we're dealing with one of these fights between different notions of the national identity. And there was if you like, Gandhi-Nehru idea of the Indian national identity, which really meant to include all the different faiths. And for a long time, it was dominant. I mean, what is really worrying is that if you go back to the 1960s, the kind of thing represented by the present ruling party, the BJP, was represented by the Hindu Mahasabha, which was a tiny group. It had virtually no members of parliament. And it's since grown, right? So the issue is always, in all these cases, not nationalism, if you like, not national identity, but two very different versions of the national identity fighting it out. And what I find very worrying, and I don't have the explanation to it, is why in the present constellation, what I consider the bad kind of national identity is winning out everywhere. See, I mean, there are individual explanations in all these countries, but why is it all happening now? Is there any kind of common cause or common factor? Yeah.
We have a question from Ivan Garzon from, let me look for the question, from Colombia, who is asking, what do you think of the fact that during the COVID-19 pandemic, in many Western countries, people can go to a church to pray even alone? Is this some kind of secularism imposed by public authorities and the pretext of public health? As you know, this has been a controversial issue about maintaining churches open or not, gathering in churches. So what do you think of these controversies? What is valid of the critique? What is not valid?
Well, I don't think it's a valid critique that, for instance, there are no more Friday mosque prayers and there are no more people getting together for Mass. This is something that is obviously very dangerous foyer of spreading, could be a dangerous locus of spreading the virus. Opening churches where people can go as individuals to pray is another matter, and that's happening in a lot of countries, right? Provided people keep social distance from each other. But I think that it's not in any way a kind of secularist plot or a secularist ploy to close churches, and it's something that a great many churches and religious communities have quite freely accepted as being something necessary.
Then we have two questions which are similar, political theory. One comes from, Jason Blakely, a professor of political theory at Pepperdine. And he writes, you seem to affirm aspects of the liberal tradition especially pluralism. Yet many of the new socialist millennials in the USA think of themselves as post-liberals. How do you conceive of the relationship between your social democratic commitments and liberalism? In what sense are you a liberal? Should we be liberals or post-liberals?
Mhm. Well, I think that liberal is one of these words that has so many different meanings that you can't take a stance towards liberalism without specifying. So let me specify. I think there is a kind of liberalism, could be called that, which I'm calling pluralism, the acceptance of difference and the belief that the difference enriches us and not impoverishes us, and that we should be open and we should exchange. And then there's a kind of thing which you can call maybe neoliberalism, which is a quite unjustified faith in markets, not only to maximize production, but also to make sure that everybody benefits from the results of production, benefits from wealth. That has been an immense illusion, which somehow people like Hayek have foisted on the world, together with the political movements around Reagan and Thatcher and so on. And I think we see the utter refutation of that in the present crisis, that we just have not prepared ourselves. We starved various public services. We have radically increased inequality. We have increased plight of deprivation, which we thought we had no obligation to relieve. And this is, of course, more the case in the United States than anywhere else in the Western world. And so if neoliberalism is liberalism, I'm totally against it. And I think this is what the young millennials are saying in the United States today, who are part of the Democratic victory in the midterms, and I hope will be part of the Democratic victory in next November. I think that they're thinking of that as liberalism. But it's a terrible confusion to think that all these different things, openness, willingness to exchange, sense of enrichment by difference, and Reagan, Thatcher, US Republicans are part of the same world, the same ideal. It's just the single word which unites those different views.
Then we have a question from a student of political theory. He's a Ukrainian doing his PhD at Leuven University, Victor Poletko, who writes, in your works on political secularism, you often express an optimistic attitude as to the prospects of reaching an overlapping consensus and a set of central liberal notions in the sense that they can support from diverse intellectual traditions, despite some opposing metaphysical claims of those intellectual traditions. Do you remain optimistic on that?
Yes, I am. I mean, I do, because I realize there's a danger, because as we see, various people turn their version of the national identity into something which is seen to be absolutely essential to living that national identity. And they then not only want to win out, but they want to make their gains irreversible. So they end up destroying democracy, right? But there can be this kind of unity of citizens across difference. So I would say my notion of democracy and liberalism could be summed up by going back to the original French Republican trinity: liberté, égalité, fraternité, liberty, equality. I would replace fraternity with a gender-neutral term of solidarity. I think if your notion of democracy doesn't include a very powerful sense of solidarity between all citizens, then you have a very inadequate democracy, which is heading for one of these terrible populist deviations. So I think that if we include solidarity in our picture of what democracy requires, then we have a really adequate view, and we can be in solidarity with people that are not exactly carbon copies of our outlook. We're asked to do that every time we open our frontiers to refugees from very different cultures. And we're asked to do that whenever we unite together with citizens of very different cultures, very often different origins, and share with them in order to make sure that everybody has a decent life.
Very good. And then Gloria Moran, a scholar of canon law. I would like to ask you about the role of mediation, in particular religious mediation in the narratives of consensus and democracy.
Yeah. Well, I think, yeah, mediation, I think I can see what that questioner is getting at. Mediation is very important because one of the things we find, one of the real, diseases we find in our society is that people seem to be more and more convinced that they understand what other people are about. And this is what gets intensified in one of these populist situations, because the populist appeals demonize the elites. It's clear that they are simply interested in themselves and not have no sense of the good of the people at heart. And on the other side, you get these same elites who are dismissing populist voters as ignoramuses, as deplorables, and so on. What we really need much more of in our societies is an attempt to understand what is motivating people, including what's motivating people to do things that we totally disapprove of. I mean, this is something that I've been very engaged in Quebec, because we've had a fight about certain legislations which have been discriminatory against Muslims, for instance. But if you dig into the reasons for this, you find a very complex set of reasons, not all of which are bad. And one has to have that kind of attempt to understand what makes the opponent tick, what the deeper motivations are, because a lot of them are perfectly good, perfectly acceptable. And it's that which is missing in our societies. And unfortunately, not just missing, it's being driven to the margins. Right? The kind of polarizations we now live in encourage people to caricature and misunderstand their opponents to the point where the possibility of finding some kind of common ground, and I would say the possibility in very many cases of converting the other side to one's own side, disappear completely.
In the same vein, Marco Ferrario asked, the need of recognition, how is it connected with the crisis of democracy you mentioned? Would you like to add something about the need for recognition and the importance of this concept?
Yeah, well, I think that the recognition is the opposite.
Especially the practice.
Yeah, I think the recognition is precisely the opposite of this kind of alienation I'm talking about, where we have a completely caricatural view of the other. So that the sense that the other has, he or she has, is that when faced with us, they're faced with some kind of stereotype being plaqued on them, and what they really are like is totally unrecognized. The kinds of mediation I was talking about can lead to this sense of mutual recognition, the sense of, yeah, I get you. I don't fully agree with what you're driving at, but I sort of get where you're at as a human being. And it's that kind of mutual understanding that can help to dissolve some of these deep divisions. So I think that recognition is still absolutely one of the really important issues in our society.
I will ask you for a brief personal question asked by Brooks Valve, and you can take it into a final reflections in any direction you want. So she asked, what inspired you to study religion?
Very big question. Well, I mean,
you have 4 minutes to answer it.
4 months. No, I'll try to be faster than that. I break the question down into 2. What inspired me to begin to think about the Christian Catholic faith? And that's really very simple. That I was brought up in this extremely narrow authoritarian church, and I just couldn't see the point in any of this. But I had a sort of Christian sense, so I wanted to ask myself how to articulate it. And then the next part of the question is how I got interested in something beyond my faith. And that's because I had the great luck to have a magnificent teacher as an undergraduate, Wilfred Cantwell Smith, who later became famous as a student of Islam, set up the Islamic Institute. And he gave a course on comparative religion, which is absolutely riveting, in which he made these different faiths comprehensible to us young undergraduates in the 1950s, 40s, and 50s in Montreal. And I was carried away by that. I've never come back from that kind of interest in ecumenicism and understanding the other.
Well, on this great note, I want to thank you, Charles, very much for your openness to have this conversation with all of us. I would like to, again, thank you all of you for participating and for your interest. As I mentioned, this is just the first in our series. We already can confirm it will appear, it will be eventually appear in our website, but we know that the next conversation is going to be on July 9th. Is it July 9th, a Thursday? I believe so. Let me make sure that I got it right. Yes, on July 9th, the prominent sociologist, German sociologist Hans Joas, will be the next conversationalist. Hans Joas is actually the one who brought us together, us three together, Charles Taylor, me, and him, to be together for 1 year at the Wissenschaftskolleg in Berlin. And this is where basically Charles Taylor wrote his manuscript, A Secular Age, in conversation with many of us. There was a larger group. And since then, Hans Joas has really written very significant works on the sociology of religion. And two new books are coming out, The Power of the Sacred, and the new book he's writing on religion and freedom, and we'll be discussing those issues. I can say as an anecdote, the three of us, three Catholics in a very secular Protestant city, Berlin, a few times we appeared together in forum discussions, and we began to be known as the three Catholic tenors. Charles, would you like to add something to that?
No, I didn't know that. Well,
You didn't know that?
I forgot. My memory suppressed it, maybe. But
yes.
I guess it's a tenor, not a bass or something like that.
Well, on this note, again, thank you very much to everybody. Thank you, especially Charles. Stay safe, and we are looking forward in a few years to celebrate your 90th anniversary. I still remember the big celebration we had in Montreal, a fantastic conference, and your work, both as a philosopher, as an intellectual, as a politician in Canada. And we are looking forward to, again, celebrate your 90th anniversary in a few years. So keep safe, stay healthy, and keep us illuminating us on the complexity of the human condition as you've done through many decades. We're still looking for many important books from you as they are coming in your mature age. Thank you so much.